Okay, so thank you again for coming. Today is our presentation on CRP required management. This is a workshop, so we do want it to be interactive. If you have a question, you can speak up. We probably won't do too much talking in the middle. We'll save most of the questions for the end at the chat. In the past, some of these workshops explaining management on CRP have been in person, but we've been moving to a lot of more virtual meetings lately, which unfortunately we can't offer you pizza through the computer, so there's a downside there, but we can get a lot more information out to a lot more people. So we have people joining today from all across the state and a couple people joining even from out of the state who are just curious about what we're doing. So I'm grateful for all of you joining us today and excited to be able to get this information out to you. So we'll move to the next slide here. And we have some introductions. So my name is Tabitha Panis. I am a farm bill biologist with Pheasants Forever. I work in a partnership with NRCS, so I'm working out of the USDA office in Denison, Iowa, and I cover Crawford, Carroll, Sac, and Ida counties. We have Inga Rowan on the call with us today. And Inga, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Can you hear me, Tabitha?
Yep, I can.
Perfect. My name is Inga Rowan. I am a technician with the Department of Natural Resources here in Iowa, and I'm based in Rockwell City in Calhoun County, but I also cover Sac, Greene, Webster, and Pocahontas counties as well with private lands.
Thank you, Inga. We also have Josh Langholt on today. Josh, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Josh Langholt. I'm the district conservationist in Ida Grove, but I also work in the Denison Resource Unit, so I can help out in Crawford, Ida, Sac, and Carroll as well.
Thank you, Josh. And we also have Erica Scheckinger on the line. She is with the Farm Service Agency here in Denison, Crawford County. So Erica, if you'd like to say hi.
Hello, I think I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Erica.
Okay.
So Erica works with FSA and she's on the line here to answer questions too. So that's who will be presenting today. So I'll move to the next slide. Thank you very much. So here is a brief overview of our discussion topics for today. So we'll be going over each of these in detail. What is required management? When do we complete required management? And how can we do it? So we will go over in detail each of the practices that are listed with the bullet points there. We have grazing, haying, disking, spraying, interseeding, burning, and then we'll also be covering ongoing CRP maintenance. As you know, there are other required maintenance activities outside just the required management on a CRP contract. So those are like controlling noxious weeds, etc. And we'll get into those later. So moving on to the next slide here. What is CRP required management? So required management is a required disturbance activity. Now, why would you want to disturb your CRP? It's out there on the landscape and it looks great. We get this question a lot. So the reason we do a disturbance activity is because it helps maintain diversity and it helps promote early successional habitat. So succession means as time goes on in the state of Iowa, the way our succession works is, we have a diverse native grass and wildflower mix maybe, and over time that will tend to become more grass dominant, and then eventually we'll get trees and shrubs, woody encroachment, and things turn to forest here. So to maintain grassland habitat, that's the main reason we have these required management activities. So these plant communities are a lot more resilient than one might think. Fire can scarify seeds to promote, regeneration. Fire removes harmful diseases and bacteria, and it creates, fire and other practices like spraying and disking can promote more forb activity, set back our grasses, eliminate a thick grass thatch layer, which is really important for a lot of our ground nesting birds. As you can see here to the picture on the top right, we have a pheasant hen with her brood. And as you can see, those pheasant chicks are tiny. So probably golf ball size or smaller. So I don't know if any of you like to hunt or if you like to walk through your CRP, but sometimes, you know, you can walk out there and you're in grasses that are above your head and you're struggling to lift each leg high up so you can get through that stuff. Well, imagine if you were golf ball size, how difficult that might be to move around and find insects. So a lot of these activities can open up your stand and make it easier for wildlife to move through and utilize all of the plants and insects that they have out there. So these disturbance activities a lot of times are part of the historic forces of nature that used to spread across the Midwest and the plains and the state of Iowa. So you know, our native plant species are really used to bison munching on them and fires moving through. So that's kind of what have helped maintain and create, you know, diverse prairie and our native grass and wildflower stands. So another reason that we can, we'll go on, sorry, I was kind of still talking on the previous slide here. So thank you. So another thing that it can help control is like our noxious weeds, our woody vegetation, and obviously varying structural diversity, which is kind of what I talked about a little bit. So one thing I will say here is, you know, it's important to go out and take a look at your CRP, maybe note what problems you have out there. Do you have noxious weeds? And maybe note what good things you have out there. Do you see wildlife? Do you see a lot of insects? Do you see monarchs? Do you see birds? So that you can, you know, pick a management practice that will fit your goals, whether that's, you know, getting rid of problems or helping what is good that you have out there. So we'll switch to the next slide here. And this is just a really good visual example of, you know, what required management can do. So on the left here, we have a picture of CRP that looks really diverse. We have tall native grasses. I see some purple flowers in there, which are probably bee balm or wild bergamot, which are really good for our pollinators, especially our bees. We have some yellow flowers in the background, which they're kind of distant, might be difficult to tell what they are, but I guess they could be partridge pea, they could be black-eyed Susan. So we see a number of wildflowers, nice tall native grasses, and that's what management, when done right, can do. So, and then on the right side here, we have a picture that doesn't look as diverse. It's clearly monoculture, a stand of predominantly one grass, and it looks like it's a reed canary or brome. And we have woody encroachment coming in on the sides. So this is getting farther down in that line of succession, moving from a, you know, a diverse mix of species to more of a monoculture, lots of woody species. So this is just a nice visual example for you here. On to the next slide here. We have another visual example of cedar trees encroaching on a hillside of what is probably grasses and wildflowers. Looks like the dormant season, so it's not very showy right now. But nothing grows underneath those cedar trees. I don't know if you've ever walked through. They do make good thermal cover for some critters on the very, very coldest of days, but they drop their needles and not a lot is under there. So removing some of those trees, and it looks like there's probably a prescribed fire going on at this time too. We see the smoke in the background, can set those back and just allow for a greater diversity out there. So next slide here. What practices are available to you? So we've talked about why we require management on CRP, what the benefits are, and you know, here's what you can do to complete it. So we have grazing, haying, tilling, spraying, interseeding, and prescribed burning. So as you'll see, there's a little asterisk to the side that haying and interseeding alone won't meet the required requirements. So you're going to need to pick another practice on top of it. So a lot of times people will pair haying and interseeding so that they can meet the full requirement. So as a land manager, you all are land managers with your CRP. These are all tools in your toolbox to complete your management task. So you're going to want to assess your acres, go out, see maybe what problems you have, see what good you might have, and then do some critical thinking on what management practices might align best with your goals. So we'll move on to the next slide here. When do you complete required management? So that's a great question. Outside of the primary nesting season is our main requirement. So the primary nesting season is May 15th through August 1st. So we're not going to disturb our CRP and do our management at that time, just because we have a lot of ground nesting birds and other things that are using our CRP at that time. So we're not going to go in there and do any disturbance. So usually management must be applied once on all of your acres. So this is kind of the reason of why the name change. I don't know, some of you have noticed and pointed out to me that why did it used to be called mid-contract management, but now we've called it required management. It is not just to confuse you, as some of you might think. It's because a lot of times that management doesn't take place in the middle of the contract. So if it's contract that is re-enrolling into CRP and they're starting a fresh contract, we'll often schedule management right at the beginning of the contract just because it hasn't had management for a while. Also, there are a couple practices in the state of Iowa that require a management activity twice. So calling it mid-contract management doesn't really encompass the fact that some are not done in the middle and some are done twice on the contract. So the management activity is completed on 1/3 of the contract acres per year. So that means you'll split it up in 2/3 and perform it for 3 years, except in the case if you're doing prescribed fire, we will allow that all the acres to be burned at once, as I think they realize that prescribed fire is, kind of a more difficult one to plan for. It takes a lot of planning, so they will let you do that once instead of over 3 years. Grazing can be done on all acres at once, and then contracts less than 20 acres. So if you have a 6-acre filter strip, FSA is not going to require you to split that up into 3 years. Anything less than 20 acres can be done all at once. And then obviously approved tree and shrub plantings, which no longer require management activity. So,
hey Tabitha.
Yeah.
I think I know at least one person's gotten kicked out of the call and is in the waiting room. Can you go check and let them back in, please?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, we do.
There might be a setting you can change to allow people to come and go in case they get bumped out.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I can't find this setting at the time, but I'll try to keep checking in case people get bumped out. And then if you could just send, just like you did there, let me know and I'll make sure to let them in. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right. So we'll move on to the next slide here. This slide is showing when changes are needed. So at the beginning of your contract, you'll sign up for a management activity, and then 4 years go by, and then maybe you forgot which one you selected or you want to change it. Those things happen. So let's say, you signed up originally for prescribed burning, but you decide you want to till instead. So you're going to need to talk with your FSA and RCS and just initial and sign that you're gonna, do a different management activity than what is in your conservation plan. If you are moving to haying and grazing, there's going to be a little bit of additional paperwork that needs filled out, and we'll talk about that in just a moment here on the very next slide. So we'll click to the next one. So now we're going to go over those management options that we listed earlier in this presentation. So different management options. The first one I'm going to discuss with you is grazing. So grazing must be in a conservation plan and approved before conducting the activity. So it's our only activity that we need approval before we do it. So we're seeing a lot more allowance for haying and grazing on CRP, but the necessary paperwork needs to be completed to make sure that we're doing it in the correct way. So if you are interested in grazing, you're going to want to work with your FSA, your local USDA office, local farm service agency to make sure that you have all the paperwork necessary. So grazing, like all other required management activities, needs to be done outside of the primary nesting season. So in addition, those windows are a little shorter. So April 1st through May 14th and August 2nd through September 30th are the two time frames that we can do grazing on CRP. And producers are allowed to utilize both of those periods. So those are the time frames. On to the next slide here. Just some rules about grazing. Heavy use locations will be reseeded if you graze. So, you know, loafing areas around the water, maybe trails that are created through the CRP. Any area where the cover is disturbed is going to need to be reseeded. Water and mineral are okay put out, but we do not allow supplemental feed. This is because, you know, we're not turning CRP into pasture. CRP has other purposes. So grazing is just one of our tools that we're using as a management task. It's not pasture. So that's the reason for those rules. They will, you'll work and get a conservation plan supplement, and they'll help you select a stacking rate selected so that minimum stubble heights are maintained. So that's 4 inches for introduced grasses and then 6 inches for our native grasses and wildflowers. So grazing is a good land management tool. I have seen it promote diversity in several CRP acres around the counties that I work in. So a lot of prairie species have 12,000 years of adapting to munching bison. So they're pretty resilient to that, and grazing is a good way that you can set back your grasses and promote wildflowers. So those cattle move through and they find grasses and can selectively munch. So it's a really good way to set back grasses and promote more wildflower diversity.
Looks like maybe Tabitha got kicked out, or maybe.
Sorry, I was booted off of my own meeting for a second. Now I'll be really checking to make sure nobody else gets booted off. So I apologize for that. So if everybody can still see the presentation okay, I was on the last point here. No rental rate reduction is required for grazing. So with haying, we'll see there is a slight reduction in that year's annual rental rate, but for grazing, there is not. We do encourage interseeding though, putting a little more seed out there after grazing, just so it comes back in extra nice for the next year. So on to the next slide here. Going to talk a little bit about haying. So just like grazing, haying again must be in the conservation plan and approved by the FSA County Committee prior to completing the activity. So so you're going to need to work with your local USDA Service Center to complete that conservation plan supplement if you choose haying. And so this has a little bit more of a smaller window than grazing. Our haying for required management will take place August 2nd through August 31st every year. And then bales must be removed by September 10th. And on to the next slide here about more rules on haying. Haying alone will not meet the requirement. So if you remember at the beginning, it was one of those that had that asterisk by it, and haying alone will not meet the requirement. You will need to choose interseeding, burning, tilling, and other activity that does a little more disturbance. So there is a 25% rental rate reduction for that year, and only 1 cutting is allowed. 4 inches is the minimum stubble height. And then if you have hayed for emergency, which I know a lot of people, last year we had a pretty good drought, so we fell into emergency haying and grazing. If you did hay for emergency, you must wait 3 years before you can hay again. And grazing, that is a 2-year time period that you must wait when you graze. So unless we fall into another emergency haying and grazing, then all that gets thrown out the window and you are able to hay and graze again. So just something to keep in mind, as I know a lot of haying was done last year. So with haying, you're going to want to work with NRCS to determine if you're splitting, how much of your CRP you're going to hay. So usually we have producers try to split it out into 2 years, hay 50% this year, hay the other 50% of the acres the following year. Haying and grazing, as you'll see on the next slide, cannot negatively impact the purpose of your practice. So a lot of these practices are wildlife practices, so we will try to, we will take that into consideration and say, hey, we're going to leave 50% of the acres up for winter cover this year, and then we can hay the other 50% next year. So chances are they're probably going to have you split it up a bit, but you're going to want to work with your local USDA office to determine that. Next slide here. So these are just some common rules for both haying and grazing. I've said it several times already, but you must sign up before the practice and follow the non-emergency conservation plan supplement. So just going to need to work with USDA ahead of time before haying or grazing. Land within a 20 feet of a stream or permanent water body must be excluded. There are certain practices that cannot be hayed or grazed, which are our food plots, tree and shrub plantings, or our pheasant recovery winter habitat. And so that makes a lot of sense. The participant will reseed at their own expense if the cover fails as a result of haying and grazing. And like I said before, it may not negatively impact the function of your conservation practice. So a lot of these practices are targeted to a resource concern, so they may not negatively impact that resource concern that the CRP is working to solve. All right, and then moving on here. Next, we have Josh Langholt, who's going to take it from here to talk about disking.
All right, another one of your options here is disking. Disking breaks up the sod-bound grasses and promotes diversity. It can help control the woody species. Another option that we use it a lot for is fire breaks. You go around the outside before you're going to burn and disc it. Try not to exceed more than 4 inches in depth, and we're kind of what we're shooting for is 50% residue and 50% bare ground. We may require sometimes a minimum of 3 to 4 passes. We really want to get that sod broke up. If you have thistles, it's not necessarily a great option. It can almost promote them more. If you like to go out there and do some hunting and walking, just remember that it's going to stay pretty rough after you go over it with the disc. Rotate, if we're on more of a steep area, we'd like to rotate our tilled areas in blocks or strips, especially if you're on those D or C slopes. Alternate the tilled strips less than 75% wide with an area twice the size of the tilled strip on a contour or slope. Mowing, burning, grazing, or haying may be needed prior to a tillage just to assist in breaking up some of that sod. Next slide. This is a picture of a fall disc, and it's 50% of the duff left. So this is kind of what we're after when we do the disking. Next slide. And then this is what it looked like the following June. If you notice, some of the weeds and stuff come back, so then you may have to do some mowing. Next slide. And then this is what it looks like 3 years later. So it starts to come back real nice. Next slide. Another option we have is spraying. Spraying weakens their grasses and promotes forbs. Mowing or burning sometimes can be encouraged before we do the spraying, just so we get some of that dead duff off of there, and when you spray, you're hitting that growing grass. It can be used prior to disking or interseeding. Just make sure you read and follow the label instructions. Don't spray over open water within 20 feet of a permanent or intermittent water body. What we're going to do with the spraying is we're going to use the lowest labeled rate that we achieve the desired conditions. We want to spray when the grass is actively growing. Water must be excluded from spraying and no additional activity required on the land. Think about what plant species you'll be filling in after you spray. We like to tell people that whether you're spraying for thistles and just knocking back the grass, or if you're seeding, it's all grass and you hit it with a grass selective herbicide, you may want to put some more forbs out there. So if you spray that grass, you're gonna leave the open area, and what's gonna grow back in that open area? It's either gonna be weeds. So sometimes we want to put some forbs in there so they can grow back. Otherwise, you have the potential to spray some of your forbs out as well too. So we just got to be careful there. Next slide. Sorry. Spraying what and when. So depending on what you have seeded out there, if you have a cool season grasses, so that's your brome, timothy, fescue, then we can use a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate, like Roundup or something similar to that. You can use grass selective herbicide as well. It responds best to chemical application in the early spring or fall. So these cool seasons they grow in the cool season, spring or fall. So that's when we want to hit them with the sprays, when they're actively growing. And then if you have warm season grasses like big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, your natives, we want to use a grass targeting herbicide like the Flodium. These respond best to chemical application in the early summer, early fall, or late summer, early fall. You know, they're warm season grasses, so they're growing when it's warm out, and that's when we want to hit them with the herbicide. Next slide. Another option we have is interseeding. What we use interseeding for is to modify the stand while retaining some component of the original stand. We want to increase those flowering plants that are out there for our pollinators, your butterflies, your bees, increase seed production for our birds. You know, they like to pick at the seeds and just add an overall diversity to our CRP. The more that we have more wildflowers and stuff out there, the better it looks, the better it is for all of our native animals and insects, birds, etc. Next slide. Some of the general interseeding rules here. Before interseeding, assess your existing stand. You know, do you have any weed problems out there? And we want to address those prior to interseeding. Make sure you double check if you've used any herbicides out there, what kind of residual do they have? It kind of defeats the purpose if you use a herbicide that's got a bunch of residual and then we go out there and interseed. You know, the chances are they're not gonna grow. Like haying, interseeding, it can't be done on its own, so it must be with another required management practice, such as disking, burning, spraying, grazing, haying. A lot of times we do the haying and the interseeding kind of go hand in hand. Somebody will hay and then we'll interseed those forbs back. Herbicide also may be used to restrict it to promote the forbs and legumes, you know, to knock that grass back again and let them forbs get a chance to catch up. Next slide. Some general interseeding rules. Certified or source identified seed is recommended, so you must comply with your any Iowa seed laws. After interseeding, you know, you may need to do some additional activities, you know, kind of like when you first start with your CRP, do some mowing to set back some of the grasses and weeds. Just work with us in the NRCS office. We can help you out for any establishment tips that you need. We just want to make sure that seed has a chance to germinate. Once a new seeding is established, we like to no disturbance during the primary nesting season. And again, that's from May 15th to August 1st. If at all possible, we like to try to use a local ecotype seed. So usually this is represented by a yellow seed tag on your bag. It can be a touch more expensive, but it has a better shot at growing in Iowa because it's adapted for this area. You know, if you get an ecotype that's adapted for dry, sandy, western Nebraska soils, you know, some of those plant species might have trouble growing in Iowa where we have a little more rainfall here. Next slide. Again, seed selection is big. Some of our interseeding guidelines. So if you have warm season grasses out there, we like to interseed forbs. Usually it's forb legume mix at about 10 seeds per square foot. And this is a lot of your native flowers. And then if you have cool season grasses, it's usually an introduced legume, such as maybe red clover or something similar to that. And we do that at a quarter of the full rate. Just work with your NRCS and we're happy to help you try to get something decided out there. Cost share is usually available for forb and legume interseeding. You just need to save your seed tags, any invoices that you have for, you know, the drilling, broadcasting, anything that you do out there. And FSA will not cost share on grass seed for interseeding. But, you know, maybe you don't have the best grass stand and you want to interseed some grasses as well. You can do that, but just remember it's going to be on your own expense, and just consult with your NRCS office. Next slide. This is an example of our supplement to the seeding plan. So it's for our native seeding guidelines. It's designed to show the basic requirements for seeding. So this is what we're kind of going to put it on here, minimums. We're going to give this to you. You take it to your seed vendor, and they're going to go through it and find a mix that works compared to what our minimums are. Potentially, if they have, you know, if they're out of a certain seed or something like that, well, then they can fill out on this and give you a mix, and then you bring it back to us. You know, it might be slightly different, and then we'll check it out just to make sure that it, just to make sure that it meets the requirements that that we're after with your CRP. Next slide. So if you're going to do the interseeding, here's some what we kind of recommend. We like to use a drill, or hopefully a no-till drill. If you're going to drill it, we like to be about an 1/8 inch deep. Another option is broadcast seed, and then come across it with a roller or a cultipacker. Another option is frost seeding. This is good is if you frost seed it when the ground is frozen, and then when, you know, like this time of year when it thaws during the day and then it gets cold at night, that freeze thaw cycles incorporates the seed into the soil. We'd like to, if you're going to do this, we'd like the existing cover to be less than 50% by perennial vegetation, so it allows the seed to just naturally cold stratify. If you're drilling, use a native no-till drill if possible. If as you're drilling you see some of the seed on the ground, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It all doesn't need to be super deep. Sometimes when we get too deep, they have a hard time germinating and getting through. So it's not a problem necessarily if you see some of your seed sitting on top of the ground. Sometimes they even plug the 4 boxes every other one. It just to try and get the seed out there. Broadcasting can allow for a better diversity, but sometimes it just takes a little bit longer for those to germinate and come through. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to Inga for prescribed burning.
All right, so I'm going to try not to get too tangential because I love talking about burning. So if anyone wants to talk more about burning, feel free to contact me. But today, here's what we'll be covering: why you might choose prescribed burning as your management for required management or a different time in your contract, who might be able to burn, what steps you go through when you're planning the burn, site specifics, burn conditions, hazards that you might encounter, how to make or identify fire breaks, and what equipment you might need. And then we'll talk about the day of the burn itself. So what your ignition plan might look like and what happens after you light your fire. Overall, what I want you to walk away with is an understanding that fire is a safe, effective, and cheap management tool if it's used correctly and if you put the planning in beforehand. So why might you burn instead of doing other management? Burning can help promote seed production. There are some plants that will respond to fire by producing a lot more seed. It can help stimulate historic conditions. So as Tabitha mentioned earlier, bison and prescribed fire are some of the main original disturbances that helps maintain grassland in Iowa. And burning can also be a good tool to use if you have a problem with Canada thistle, particularly burning later in the spring. So with burning, again, you still have to stay out of the primary nesting season of May 15 to August 1st, but sometime in late April to mid-May could be a good shot at setting back some of those thistles and giving your warm season grasses or your forbs or flowers a chance to go forth. This graph here just shows what effects you might see on your plant community depending on when you time your burn. Just for example, if you're looking at trees, burning at any time will have a negative impact on trees, but the best time to burn if you're trying to get rid of trees would be later in the summer. All right, who can burn? First of all, if you're seeking cost share or reimbursement for any burning activities, you should make sure that you check with your Farm Service Agency office first to see if that's available, and make sure that you are collecting and saving any invoices that you're getting and then submitting them to the Farm Service Agency. Some different options of folks who might be able to burn. There are local contractors in Iowa. You can get a list from your local NRCS office. You should be contacting them very soon if you're planning on burning this spring, and make sure that you're getting an invoice from them. Sometimes local fire departments will burn. Make sure that you still get an invoice. And you could also potentially burn if you have a burn plan, if you have enough crew members who can help you, and if you have the proper equipment. Burn plans. If you talk to your FSA office about doing a burn, they probably will have brought up having a burn plan. Almost anybody can write a burn plan. I can write a burn plan. Tabitha can write a burn plan. You, landowner or manager, can write a burn plan. NRCS and FSA employees cannot write burn plans for you, and they will not review your burn plans. So if you have burn plan questions, they're not the ones to ask. Tabitha and I would be your local office people to ask. Contractors, if you're paying somebody to do your burn, they should be providing their own burn plan. They probably have liability, well, hopefully they have liability insurance that requires them to be writing their burn plan. Make sure that you're starting early. So before the morning that you're intending to be burning, you should be writing up your plan, and we'll go through what some of the components of that will be. We in the office can help you get a template. You can see it, what the front page of it looks like on this slide. We can also help you get a map for drawing things out and brainstorming. But the main point is that a burn plan should be useful for you and for your crew. So site specifics is an important part of your burn plan. Some things you'll want to think about include what fuels you have out there. If you have tall grasses over your head versus if you have really short, low to the ground grass. Heavy fuels, so trees, brush piles, things that might light on fire and keep burning for a long time. Or if you have more fine fuels like grasses or forbs. And also consider if there are any firebrands out there, so any kind of vegetation that might be throwing sparks off or throwing off burning material, those can pose a hazard. Consider what the topography of your site looks like. There are many areas that we cover up here in Northwest Iowa that are pretty flat, but if there's a slope, fire tends to burn faster uphill. And also consider what the aspect is. So a north slope will tend to burn slower because it's usually damper and cooler. Consider what accesses you have available. So if there are fences that you're going to have to be able to get through, or gates, if there's a field drive that you need to be using, if you have to get permission from your neighbor to cross their property somewhere, if there's a 911 address, try to figure that out, because if something goes wrong and you have to meet EMS, it's good to know, or a nearby intersection where they would be able to meet you. Some other things to consider would be what water resources might be available nearby. That could be a hydrant, it could be a ditch with a portable pump setup, or there are other options available as well. When you are writing your burn plan, you're going to write what's called a prescription. So this is essentially saying what conditions you're looking for on the day of the burn. This is taken straight off of that burn plan example template that we could definitely provide to you. Some acceptable conditions are listed here just in general, but basically what you're doing is you're saying, these are the conditions that I'm looking for that are going to allow me to complete the burn with my objectives, as well as completing it safely. All of these aspects are very important, but wind is probably the most important thing for you to be thinking about ahead of time. When you're choosing a wind direction, some things that you'll want to consider is if there's anything that you're not going to want downwind. So if there's any livestock operations nearby, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources maintains a website where you can identify if there are any that happen to be nearby. If there are roads, sending smoke over an interstate versus sending smoke over a dead-end dirt road, those are going to have different impacts. If there are any neighbors, particularly think about if you have neighbors who might be on oxygen, if there's a school downwind, or if there's a town, daycare, anything like that. And also consider power lines. So power lines can be a hazard during prescribed fire, particularly if there's a chance that you might contact them with equipment, with water, or with dense smoke. All of those can arc electricity and create a much larger problem. Some other considerations are both the smoke and fire will be moving in the direction of the wind. So if there's a big patch of continuous grass downwind from you, you'll have to keep an eye on that. For grass or prairie burns, you'll want to think from 1 to 3 miles away from your burn, and make sure that you're contacting your neighbors while you're planning, as well as on the actual day of the burn. Some different hazards that are important to think about. As far as roads are concerned, roads can pose a hazard to your crew members, and your crew members can also, well, your crew members can pose a hazard to traffic, as well as smoke can pose a hazard to traffic or people who happen to be driving by really slowly looking at what you're doing. Consider if you might need to have a flagger out on the road or somebody that's letting people know that they're going to need to slow down. Power lines, like we already discussed. Wet spots, anywhere that a vehicle might get stuck. Holes, somebody could twist an ankle, somebody could fall into an old cistern. Those are both things that you want to avoid. Any steep terrain, it might limit where your equipment can access, and it might also limit where people are able to go. Fences might limit access as well as escape. One thing to consider would be making sure that you have something that you can cut a fence with if you need to on you, but also down fences can pose a hazard. You could trip on them. Snags or standing dead trees can fall, create other issues. They can light on fire. And if they're hollow, sometimes they can form what we might call a candle. So something that's going to be throwing off a lot of those firebrands, the sparks and burning material. Make sure, above all, that whoever is out there helping you with a prescribed fire, that they are aware of whatever hazards might be out there. If you have to go show them where the pile of tires are that you don't want to light on fire, make sure that you show them and that everyone is on the same page about where those things are. Fire breaks. So 2 main formats of fire breaks, something that's existing versus something that you need to create. Existing fire breaks, some examples would be a road, a field that's tilled black, bodies of water if they're wide enough, mowed turf, something that's just already existing that could deter or serve as a barrier against fire. Different types of fire breaks that you could create might be disked, as Josh discussed earlier, mowed fire breaks, especially if you're able to mow them in the fall and remove a lot of that duff and vegetation that's built up, and then mow them again in the spring before you burn, so that you have a little flush of that green growth, because that's going to help prevent fire from passing through it. Hand line is also an option, so constructing line by getting down to mineral soil with a shovel or heavy use of a rake, something along those lines. And also make sure that you're removing thatch. So in this example, you can see somebody using a leaf blower. You could also use a rake just to try to get any material that you're breaking up off of the line. Make sure that you're clearing around power poles, signposts, tile inlets, anything that might light on fire or melt. And your fire break should be at least 4 times the height of your fuel, or 15 feet in width, whichever is greater. So if you have grasses that are above your head that you're going to be lighting on fire, you're going to need a pretty wide fire break for those. So equipment that you'll want to think through before you go about doing your burn. So what clothing you're wearing is going to be important. You can wear fancy Nomex if you have it. That's what wildland firefighters tend to wear. But anything non-synthetic is good. So something that's 100% cotton or wool. Synthetic materials will melt and stick to your skin, and those can cause burns. Leather gloves and boots are important. Safety glasses or goggles. Depending on the conditions, you might need hard hats, both because of potentially things like falling trees, but keep in mind that a person wielding a shovel might accidentally bonk someone on the head. So hard hats can definitely help protect against that. Different hand tools. We always recommend that everybody on your line, on your crews, are going to be carrying a hand tool. And hand tools are designed to work against this fire triangle, going back to your physical science class in middle school. In order to have fire, you need oxygen, heat, and fuel. So anything that you can do to help reduce any of those is going to help suppress the fire. A flapper, which you can see in this image on the left-hand side, you can use to smother the fire, so that helps reduce access to oxygen to help cool down the fire behavior. Rakes help you move around the fuel part of the fire triangle. Make sure that you're not raking, burning things out of your fire, that you're only pushing them into where your fire is occurring. Shovels, chainsaws, and leaf blowers can all also be useful tools. Water resources. Some folks have tanks on their ATVs, tractors, truck tanks. Hoses, make sure that your hose isn't laying in the fire because they will melt. Backpack sprayers might also be an option, something you can fill with water. You can usually access areas that your heavier equipment might not be able to reach. Other important things to consider are communications. So you want everyone in your crew to be able to communicate with each other. Maybe you're within earshot, but if not, make sure that you have phones, that you have each other's numbers, that you have two-way radios if you need them. Make sure everyone on your crew has a map and a plan and understands what the plan is out there, essentially. And folks should have water and food. Sometimes burns end up going longer and you don't want anyone getting hungry and cranky out on the line. And also having a fire source is important. So don't forget that you'll need something like a drip torch, a lighter, matches, a fusee, something to actually start your fire. So talking about the burn itself, so everything past this point is also included in your burn plan, but it's kind of going through the day of and what's going to happen. So the day of your burn, you're going to make sure that you're checking the weather and the forecast and seeing if it meets your prescription. So you're going to need to meet the prescription that you've already written out in your plan, but also look at what the forecast is going into the future. Maybe there's a thunderstorm coming in, for example. Yes, it might bring rain and help calm down the fire activity, but fronts can also bring in high winds and other hazards, lightning. Make sure that you're abiding by any burn bans and avoiding red flag warning days. So burn bans are issued by the state fire marshal, and red flag warnings are when relative humidity is super low, there's low moisture in the fuel on the ground, like if it's been dry for a long time, if you're in a drought like we've been, and if there are high winds also. And you'll see on this National Weather Service page, the days that show the red flag, those are red flag warning days. You shouldn't be burning on those days. Fire weather can get really complicated. You can take whole classes on it, but some other things to consider are if it's sunny, you're probably going to have increased fire behavior over a cloudier day. And fire tends to be most active between the hours of 2 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's just when the humidity tends to be lowest, temperature tends to be highest. And those could be good or bad things, just depending on what you're looking for and what you're trying to burn. Continuing on the day of the burn, make sure that you're contacting your local sheriff or dispatch. You can just use a non-emergency number in your fire department and just letting them know what you're doing and where you're doing it. In case something goes wrong, they're going to want to know how to find you, and in case they get calls from anybody about smoke or fire, they'll know who to reach out to in that case. Make sure that you're letting your neighbors know again, who you've already let know previously, that you're going to be doing your fire. Make sure that you inspect your site and your fire breaks and your equipment. Make sure that everything works, that you've got fuel, that you have water. And then brief your crew. So assign who your burn boss is, who's going to have kind of the final word on what's happening during the fire. Make sure that everyone has maps and plans and their personal protective equipment. That everyone has communications by programming phones or setting up your radios. And make sure that you have contingency plans as well. So at what point are you going to need to if a fire gets into a ditch, maybe you can just fight it head on still, maybe pinch it off at the road. But if there's a fire escape, please don't hesitate to call 911. There are people who are more trained to handle fires, and it's important to not get in too far over your head. There's a saying in special forces that is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and that's just something to keep in mind as you're burning. If you're taking it slow, things are going to go more smoothly, and that's going to end up with your burn being accomplished a lot faster than if you rush through it and end up with a larger problem. Okay, so ignition sequence. This is the direction that you are lighting the fire in. What we like to do is, how we say, fight fire with fire. So you start at your point that's most downwind. Going back to the wind direction thing, sometimes folks think that it's better to burn when the winds are like lighter or more variable, but that's not the case, because then they tend to switch around and be more variable when they're light. You want a consistent wind from one direction when you're burning. So in this example, there's a wind from the northwest direction. So the ignition started down here in the southeast corner. And the tactic is to use the backfire. So you're lighting fire against the wind, and that fire is going to spread more slowly. It's going to be more controlled. Management-wise, it can give a chance for more critters to escape, and it also allows that fire more residence time on the ground to counteract things like woody vegetation that you might have. And then your ignition crews move along to flank the fire, so lighting parallel to the wind direction before they may come to a point where they are lighting with the wind. When you're lighting with the wind, you're lighting what's called a head fire. It's much faster, it can be dangerous, and it can also burn off the tops of your vegetation without actually consuming the duff and the fuel that's at the bottom. So here's an example of ignition plan. Just a couple things to point out. Marking off what your drop points are. So they're points that you can reference when you're talking to whoever you're burning with. So here you're starting at drop point 1. You have 2 crews. One crew is moving towards drop point 2 and one crew is moving towards drop point 3. They are starting at that point. They're building black line with backfire. So they're allowing that vegetation to get consumed with the fire before they're doing any lighting up in the direction, or lighting anything where there's going to be unburned vegetation downwind from the direction of the wind. And then make sure that you're totally closing off your fire. So you'll want to have black line all the way around by the time that you're done. Make sure that you're watching the wind. Sometimes wind directions change, and watching the fire behavior and the smoke, predicting what might happen into the future, and communicating what you're seeing with other folks who are out there with you. This is just another example. In this one, a couple of things to note are the alternate water sources that are notated, so places that your crew could go get more water if needed. In this example, there's a southeast wind, so they're starting at drop point A, just a different naming convention. The surrounding cover is notated on this map, so you can see there's row crop, there's warm season grasses, there's a wetland, just so that you kind of know what's around and what points might be more dangerous or more important to pay closer attention to. And then also you can see the fire breaks that are drawn out on this map. So it shows both natural fire breaks, so ones that are existing, like roads, and then also some mowed fire breaks that they've put in. Make sure that you're following your ignition sequence. Not everything may burn, but you should still be putting fire to it. For example, if there's standing water, it's probably not going to all evaporate and light on fire. Make sure that you're doing mop-up. So after you're totally done with your ignitions, go at least 20 feet inside of your burn unit. Make sure that there's nothing that's smoking or smoldering or hot before you would leave the unit at all, and make sure that you're monitoring it for at least 48 hours after. You want to be checking and rechecking it. So you want everything to be out and cold before you're totally giving up. And sometimes high winds come up, and you might end up with some fire rekindling. So make sure that you're keeping eyes on it, that you're checking on it, and making sure that you're not just throwing a match in and then walking away. If you have any invoices, they should be turned into the Farm Service Agency. And if you want to, after you're complete completely done with your burn, you can turn your burn plan into your NRCS. Check with your office first, but they might be able to keep it on hand, for example, in case you need to burn that unit later on. All right, and I think Tabitha is going to talk again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Inga. I love prescribed fire. I think a lot of people do, and it's just important to, learn how to do it safely. I think I feel really lucky, growing up, you always hear that fire is bad. I did anyways, probably not everyone, but then to just learn that it's such a unique management tool, and it's also a lot of fun. So, if you haven't burned as a landowner, I know there's a lot of landowners that do, and if instead of starting with your own ground on your first time, maybe you could hop in with somebody else and learn that way. So thank you so much for sharing all that. So I'll move on here. I will say what I've said already, so I apologize for saying it again, but it's very important. So if you'd like to switch to a different management activity, we're going to need to update your conservation plan. So to make sure that you're in compliance, just maintain open communication about what you want to do, and that will, save you any trouble in the long run. So once your management activity is completed, you're going to need to sign the FSA 848A and B, which basically are Farm Service Agency documents that certify that you've completed the management activity. So we're going to need to certify that, and then the Farm Service Agency is also going to need invoices, seed tags, receipts, any documentation that you have that the management activity has been completed. I have a special note here to save the seed tags. Those are the ones that are most often forgot about, I think, because they're right there on the bag, and people just toss them out and they get lost. So just make an extra special note to save the seed tags. Those are important. Moving on here, other maintenance. So kind of switching gears here from the management that's required on CRP to usually in the middle of the contract, that management activity, to just ongoing maintenance. So these are things that you're going to be doing over the years of the contract to keep that CRP meeting requirements and looking good, and being as beneficial as they can for wildlife, water quality, and soil erosion, whatever types of practices they were put in place to be. So outside of required management, you're going to need to manage invasive species, noxious weeds, keep volunteer trees out, and maintain that cover. So to do this, for noxious weeds, you might need to spot mow, spot spray. Maybe you want to complete an extra burn. Those are all things that you can do. So FSA, the Farm Service Agency, is pretty open about allowing producers to spot mow and spot spray when needed. So for example, with thistles, you're going to need to maybe mow in the primary nesting season. So you're going to want to make sure you get permission before you do anything in the primary nesting season, but it's definitely not unheard of to have to go out there and spot mow and spot spray. So that's, a targeted approach, not mowing the whole thing or spraying the whole thing. It's going to be targeted to whatever issue is out there that needs resolved. So the next slide here, thistles. So thistles is a common noxious weed that a lot of landowners battle, and I get a lot of questions about. So, they are a tricky one, and they're pretty prevalent out there on the landscape. So a couple ways you can try to manage thistles are to mow and to spray. So first I'll talk a little bit about mowing. You're going to want to make sure to mow thistles right before they flower or as they're flowering. So as they're flowering, you're really going to need to hit them then with a mower to knock off the flower before it goes to seed. Once you see it white and fluffy and drifting away, it's going to be too late. And thistles put out a lot of seeds. So mowing is a really good way to prevent that seed from being viable and from them from spreading. It's not going to kill the actual plant that you've just mowed. That plant is going to exist and thrive next year or later in the year, but it's going to set them back so that they're not going to spread and double in size in areas out there. So that's one management technique. The other is to spray. So you can spray in the fall is a really good time to hit them. This is what I usually suggest to landowners is to use an aminopyralid. So that's like a milestone. And there's a time period in October where, you know, we've had a frost or two. Your wildflowers or the other good species in your CRP are going dormant. So they're not green anymore. They've taken a lot of the energy back into their roots and they're going dormant for the winter, but the thistles are still green. And so if you can hit the thistles at that time, that's a really good time where they'll take in that chemical and pull them back down to their roots. And then a lot of the good things that you have out there are not going to be hit. So, you know, people will use something like a 2,4-D, just a general broadleaf herbicide. That will work on thistles, but it will also work really well on anything else, any other broadleaf it comes into contact with. So I try to stray away from that unless, you know, there's nothing out there that you want to harm. But oftentimes people have a lot of good wildflowers out there that they don't want to kill off. And it's really important not to just broadcast spray everything because, you know, you're going to need those wildflowers that you planted in the first place out there to move in and fill the gap where the thistles were. So I'm sure everybody knows, you know, if you have bare ground out there without doing anything, it's not going to be bare ground for long. Something's going to move in. So you want to set back your thistles while promoting what's out there to fill in. So that's really important. And if anybody has more questions about thistles, that's a real brief overview. We do have a lot of resources out there, so I can connect you with some of those if you have thistle issues. So moving on here to the next slide. Sod forming invasive grass. So this is another one that producers are have to manage out there on their CRP. So a couple examples here are two very most common are brome, smooth brome, and reed canary grass. So smooth brome, you know, it's in ditches, it takes over from a lot of different places, and reed canary grass tends to stick to wetter areas. But both of them are, you know, non-native and just are really vigorous and can move in and push out some of the things we want in CRP. So some practices are cool season and allow for, you know, smooth brome is in the mix. And so a lot of times those are geared towards soil erosion. You know, that's why brome is used on terraces and waterways, because it's really good at moving in and covering the ground so we don't have soil erosion. But as far as like in our pollinator practices, you know, you're not going to want smooth brome in there. So a couple things you can do are spray grass selective herbicides and time your burns. So these are cool season grasses. And if you hit them later in the year with a fire, they're, you know, they've done a lot of their growing already early in the spring. They're pretty far developed. If you can hit them with a fire at that time, it's going to be really smoky because there's a lot of moisture in that those grasses, but that's going to do the most damage on setting back brome and being good for maybe other species that you have out there. So consider, you know, Inga had a really good slide about what time of fire is good for what set of species. So that's a good one to look back at and consider timing fire to try to set these back. So next slide here, we'll move on to stump treating. So as we've said before, volunteer trees are not an acceptable cover type in CRP. Of course, some practices are tree and shrub practices, so those do allow trees and shrubs, obviously. But as far as volunteer trees that come and move in, those need to be cut. So, you know, you're going to want to cut them and treat them with an herbicide that prevents resprouts. So any deciduous, you're going to need to treat with an herbicide. Otherwise, you're going to turn, you know, if you just mow it or cut it, you're going to turn, instead of a tree, you're going to have a bush with a bunch of resprouts. So you're going to need to use a chemical. Glyphosate works, like a Roundup will work for that. Except for cedars, you don't need to chemically treat cedar trees. For whatever reason, they really don't resprout. If you cut them below their lowest branch, they won't resprout. So that's nice, can save you a little money and work out there if you are battling cedars versus deciduous. There are other chemicals that work besides glyphosate. I know people use Tordon or Garlon. Those are tree-specific herbicides, and those will work as well. I think a lot of people are moving away from some of like the Tordon because it has a really long half-life in the soil. So you do want to pay attention to how long those herbicides are out there, so it's not harming anything else out there that you have that's good. And also, one thing important that's important to know is to pay attention to the weather. Some herbicides will wash off. Like if you're doing this in the morning and you have a big storm coming in the afternoon, pay attention to if your herbicide's going to stick, if it's an oil-based and it's going to stick on to that tree stump, or if it's just going to wash away. That's important because, you know, nothing more frustrating than spending a lot of time doing something and not having it work out. So just covering all your bases and planning it right so that you can get the most effect out of your efforts. Next slide here is about maintaining cover. So maintaining cover is something that landowners and producers have to do throughout the entirety of the contract. So incidental driving is okay on CRP if you're not tearing up the cover. So you're going to really want to make sure if, you know, if you're out there driving around, maybe you're looking to see what issues you have, you know, don't do it when it's super wet and slick and you're going to tear up the cover because those areas will need to be reseeded. Similarly, you know, they're not supposed to be used as travel lanes. So continuously driving into where the cover is torn up is going to need to be reseeded. So I think most people are pretty aware of that one. Moving on to the next slide here. I'm going to briefly talk about status reviews. So CRP is reviewed periodically. There are a number of them throughout the contract. USDA just kind of restructured this. So there's going to be, I think, 4 set status reviews. And so that's when a USDA employee or a partner staff will come out, take a look at your CRP, make sure that the cover is maintained, make sure nobody's driving on it, and just kind of note issues that might be out there. And then the purpose of it isn't to get anybody in trouble. It's to help you note those issues that you have before they turn into a huge problem. You know, I mean, you'd rather know that you have a small thistle patch in the corner that you're going to need to go out and spray before your whole CRP is turned to 50% thistles across the board and you have to spend all the money to reseed out of pocket. So these are really hopefully to help you. The final status review will happen 1 year before the contract expires, and we do it that way so that you can have 1 year to know what issues you might have out there, or if it can just re-enroll as is. And so you'll have 1 year to go fix any issue before, if you want to re-enroll, before you re-enroll. So you're not in a situation where you have 1 month to go cut all the trees and try to do everything that needs to be done. So it's just there so you have enough time. So yeah. Next slide here. Just a quick note about equipment and contractors. So, you know, not everybody has a no-till drill or all the equipment they need to complete whatever activities need to be done on their CRP. So different county conservation boards, soil and water conservation districts sometimes have equipment for lend. So, you know, that's worth reaching out to see if you can get, borrow something from someone. And then your local USDA Service Center will have a list of contractors that you can hire to do the work too. They'll have a list of seed dealers, they'll have a list of earthwork contractors, contractors that do CRP maintenance. So it's worth reaching out, you know, if you're gonna have somebody help you do it, worth reaching out to your local USDA Service Center to get a list of contractors. I just always suggest make sure to, you know, call a few of them, get an estimate and get a feel for their type of work so that you can, you know, choose the best contractor, because it is up to the CRP participant to choose the contractor that will complete the work for them. So that's one suggestion I have. So finally here, we'll move to our last slide, I believe. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. We have our contact information up here. We'll leave it up for a few minutes. And now I'd like to open it up for some questions or some discussions. So I see a couple people writing down our information, which is good. We love it when people reach out to us and are interested and engaged. And, you know, I think we all really enjoy that. It makes our work worthwhile. So please do contact us and reach out as, you know, time goes on and different things happen, situations change, and maybe you have some questions. So if anybody would like, I do not see any questions in the chat anymore. I'm not sure if that's because I was kicked off and they went away. So we don't have any questions in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying I don't see any at least chats to
Hey,
everyone.
Tabitha, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Matt. This is a question about interseeding. So if you interseed in March, let's say you go out there into a stand of a cool season grass such as brome,
Mhm,
and you put your forbs in,
mhm.
is it acceptable to come back and mow that brome off before the forbs really get started? Is that a good management practice to try and set back the
Yeah.
brome? Or do you need some other kind of herbicide program, such as a cool season grass herbicide, to control that?
So depending on how thick the brome is, I think I really would hit it with a grass selective herbicide once before. And I mean, you can use a low label rate, so it's not going to completely knock it out, but I would recommend doing that for best results, because especially with brome, it spreads by rhizomes and by seed. So it's putting seed into the air, and then it's got, you know, just a really thick matted root bed that it spreads by. So it's a thick one that can really choke out other species that you're trying to put out there. So I would suggest setting it back with a grass selective herbicide, and then definitely mowing after establishment.
What's a good herbicide that's selective for cool season grasses?
So that's a good question. I'm not a chemical expert, but I know a lot of people use like a Select Max, I think, is one that is a grass selective. Josh, do you have, I feel like you know pretty well.
Yeah, I've actually used that Select before. It works really well. Just know it takes some time for it to kick in. So you use it and you think it's not working. Just it can take a couple weeks sometimes.
Great. So the thought is you could interseed that, have those seeds in the ground, and then come back where you see the planter tracks and apply the Select Max. That would be acceptable.
Would probably spray first and then try to wait for it to do its thing. But I'm not sure. Josh, do you have experience doing it spraying after? I know that people do with different chemicals. It always makes me a little nervous to put chemical on top of seed. You're just going to want to pay attention to the residual. I mean, with a Select Max, it's not going to hurt a broadleaf, but Josh, do you have any opinion there?
Not really. Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't had any experience with it really. Sorry.
Yeah, we can look into that for you. That's a great question. Because I know people will do it with glyphosate. They'll seed and spray glyphosate pretty close within the same window. But I'm not sure about a grass selective spraying after or before.
The glyphosate would take out your broadleaves as well, and that's the idea, is to set back just your grass, not your broadleaf.
Yeah. I guess I was talking about, you know, sometimes people, like, let's say they have a brome pasture and they're going to seed natives. They will, you know, spray it and seed it the same day, which to me would make me nervous. I've just heard of different county conservation boards or land managers doing that. But I'm just not sure with I don't really see a problem, since it is grass selective, doing it spraying after you've seeded like that.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there would be an issue, but
yeah, good question. And then as far as the establishment mowing, you probably will want to establish, you know, if you're putting wildflowers out there, you're probably going to want to mow it a couple times just to let those get enough sunlight, just like anyone would do at the beginning of their CRP contract during establishment. So yeah, just the one thing to know is that if you're going to be mowing anytime in the primary nesting season, you're going to need to check with your local USDA Service Center, the Farm Service Agency. They're going to want to know that, and they need it approved before you mow in the primary nesting season. So great question. Thanks, Matt. All right. So we have a couple in the chat. The Tallgrass Prairie Center, so this is Andrew Dunham. The Tallgrass Prairie Center also has a statewide curated list of native seed and service providers that we update annually and post on our website at www.tallgrassprairiecenter.org. Thank you, Andrew. That is a great resource. So there are other resources out there too for landowners if they're interested in native seeds. So the Tallgrass Prairie Center is another great resource that people can take a look at. Zach says that Josh slightly touched on the benefits of diversity in CRP, looks better and supports more pollinators. Would any panel leader like to expand on the benefits of maximizing diversity on the landscape? What a good question. Thank you for that question. So I know I could touch on it a little bit. Inga, do you want to give that one a shot?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different approaches, but I think, so to me, diversity is really equated with resiliency. So, I mean, anytime that you have a disease or specific condition like drought conditions or something adverse that happens or a weed that moves in, the more diversity you have, the more resilient your plant community will be. Something that's, or a diverse mix, you'll have things that are able to colonize wet pockets that might open up. You'll also have those benefits to different sorts of critters. So a lot of different kinds of seeds, different food sources for different insects and birds and mammals. You'll have variety in your growth structure. So you'll have some, like those open spaces down below. You'll have some things that are higher up, maybe something a bird could perch on, like a tall, stiff compass plant. The more diversity you have, I guess, the better off you're set up to encounter any potential issues. Yeah, and I guess diversity, the systems that are the most diverse are the remnants and the ones that have persisted for such a long time. And I feel like maintaining that diversity is kind of critical to maintaining the health of that system in the long term.
Great answer. Yeah, great answer. Definitely important for resiliency. I like how you touched on the fact that remnants are the most diverse too. And I think, you know, with a lot of the grass and forbs, CRP we see out there, a lot of them, especially the natives, are really, what they're trying to do is a prairie reconstruction. So, you know, it's not remnant, it hasn't been there since the dawn of time, but we're reconstructing what, you know, a past condition. So, you know, several hundreds of years ago, before we had all the changes that we've seen on the landscape, these are the kinds of things that were here. And so they're going to really benefit the species that we have out here that still use them. So yeah, to me, diversity is just important because you know, it kind of starts at the bottom with your soil, you know, and then it builds up from there. The healthier soil you have, the more of a diverse plant community you're going to have. And the more of a diverse plant community, the more insects are going to be able to thrive in that area. And those are the basis of the food chain for a lot of the species that we love to see out there, like deer, turkey, pheasants, you know, bald eagles. So we kind of tend to focus on the bigger things that we can see, but there's so much more going on that we, you know, miss, maybe not paying attention to, or that we just physically can't see with our eyes because, you know, they're happening. It's, you know, microfungus in the soil or nematodes or, you know, different things that are going on. So diversity is just really important for, I'd say, all wildlife. And I think diversity is probably one of the biggest #1 goal of land managers is to promote diversity. So yeah, thank you so much for the question. How does everybody think about that? Does anybody else have anything to add about diversity? Differing thoughts, similar thoughts? That's okay if you're too shy to speak up. I know you all have a lot going on in your head about diversity. But yeah, so does anybody else have any questions? You can unmute yourselves or type into the chat. Questions, comments, concerns, amazing ideas and epiphanies you got about what you're going to do for your land management while watching this.
Got a quick question.
Yeah.
Does FSA or NRCS review these plans on an ongoing basis, or or is that the responsibility of the landowner?
So, it's mostly falls on I would say the landowner to follow their conservation plan. So, when you enrolled in CRP at the beginning, we gave you a conservation plan. And so that's what landowners need to follow. But we try to do a lot to help remind people as time goes on, because if people are anything like me, if you tell me, okay, here's what you're going to have to do in 4 years, I am never going to remember that, So we do send out letters in the mail and different things to people, like when their management activity is coming up. So we try to stay on top of it, keep a record, and when people need to do things, let them know, because obviously it's not very fair to try to have you remember a conversation you had with NRCS 10 years ago. So, but another point, that communication is really important. So if questions come up, if you want to change something, just, maintaining open communication. So I'd say those letters that go out about management are an important reminder and communication tool, as well as our status reviews. So we do get to take a look at them every couple of years. Sometimes they're kind of quick looks. We drive by, maybe we'll drive through and make sure we can see the whole landscape, so there's not something, an issue where we can't see, but we will do a quick drive through and just know what cover type is out there and if we see any issues. So, and producers will receive a copy of that status review in the mail, just saying, hey, we were out there. A lot of times, I think USDA employees and contract employees like myself try to give the landowner a heads up before we go out there. So we do try to give them a call, just, in case you're out there with your family hunting, or, you're not expecting anybody and it surprises you. So we do try to give a heads up, but I know sometimes when there's a long list of status reviews to do, not everybody always ends up getting the notice, the heads up, the phone call. Just some information there, but yeah. Inga, do you have anything to add to that, or Josh?
I was just going to say, and you kind of hit on it, that previously we didn't do as good a job with the status reviews as we would have liked, and it's kind of been changed. They're really pushing us to do more of those and more often. So hopefully everybody's is going to get looked at more often than they had in the past.
Tabitha, Marty Helber, I have a question if you have time.
Yeah, Marty, go ahead.
One of my pollinator plots is going into its 3rd year, looking just beautiful, especially when you're looking for purple flowers.
Yeah.
Most of those purple flowers are musk thistles.
Yeah.
How do I control those without killing off all the yellows and pinks and oranges and
yeah, yeah, of course. So it's a tough one that a lot of people battle. You might be a little luckier, because I don't think those musk thistles can be quite as bad as Canada thistles, and they stick up pretty tall, so you'll be able to see them out there.
Those too.
Oh, okay. Well, so I would just, like I said with that the slide on thistles we had before, mowing them before they put fluffy seed out there is going to be really important. They put off, just tons of seed, and so mowing them beforehand is going to be really important. And then spraying, and the mowing, just be as targeted as you can. If you hit a couple of your other good things out there, it's not going to end their lives. They're gonna go on and be just fine. But the spraying is where you're going to want to be really careful, and that's where I would suggest that aminopyrrolid, like a milestone. So there are, and I had a list at one time, I'm sure I have it somewhere on my computer, but there's a list of wildflower species that are really good for being resilient to milestone. So I know that Monarda, the bee balm, is pretty resilient to milestone. Purple prairie clover is pretty resilient to milestone. So there's a list of wildflower species that we can put out there that are going to be really pretty resilient to that chemical, and then just timing it so that we try to make sure our wildflowers are dormant and our thistles are still green. So like October timeframe, had a couple frosts already. Those thistles are just tough buggers and will still be out there green. That's a good time, a really good time to hit them. So if you're going to be putting in new CRP, it might be worth a shot at looking. You can work with me or Inga on getting a seed mix together that incorporates a lot of those wildflowers that have some resistance to that chemical we'll use on thistles. And that's just, you know, excellent planning ahead so that, you know, you can foresee that you might have an issue on adjacent acres in the future. We've selected this seed mix to have wildflowers in there that are going to be resilient. Because like I said, you know, if you kill everything off and use a harsher chemical, that's going to just hit all the broadleaves. You're exactly right. You're going to kill off your pretty oranges and reds and purple. So, you know, and you're going to really need those guys to move in once those thistles are gone, because, you know, there's got to be seed in your seed bed. And so, I mean, if you just kill and make a big dead patch, you're going to have weeds again, likely thistles again. So, yeah, that would be what I would suggest. Inga, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so just kind of to follow up, sorry, wait,
Sure.
is that just my feedback that I'm hearing? Okay, so as far as thistles are concerned, it sounds like your CRP is pretty early in its contract if it's just 3 years in. So probably a lot of, I mean, your grasses and some of your other plants are still kind of focusing more of their energy on establishing their roots, and maybe they haven't totally shown up above ground. Musk thistles, bull thistles, those really tall ones with the big purple flowers, those are biennial. So another option for counteracting those would be doing something like spading them. Basically, if you get the root out of the ground before the plant goes to seed, you effectively killed that plant. Canada thistles are definitely different. They spread both by the seeds, but they also spread through rhizomes. So their roots are a lot finer, more like a sod, you could kind of say, underground. So those ones you can't remove just by taking the root out. But those tall thistles, they have a pretty thick root. If you take like a spade and get it, so before the plant goes to seed, when it just has its flower head on, if you get your spade down into the ground, force the spade over, you can kind of pop the root out, shake some of the dirt off, toss it out. You can take it out of your CRP planting if you want to, but if there's an area where you just have a few of those, they're pretty easy to just remove without having to get out your mower or do any spraying or anything. And then over time, hopefully those other things that you've planted can help recolonize some of those spaces. That would be, I guess, my main additional thing, but I feel like Tabitha's other points were all very, very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
good point. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Anytime we can avoid, you know, using chemical, I think is awesome. Sometimes it just depends on every situation and every landowner's willingness to, you know, be as targeted as they can stomach, is what I tell people. I stole that from a colleague of mine, so I didn't come up with it, but it's a good thing to remember. So we have another question in the chat. Could a weed whacker be used on weeds when they are short and in smaller patches? I would say definitely. If you are going to go out there with a weed whip on your thistles, that's a great way to be more targeted. A lot of times people go out with, you know, they might be a little tough on your weed whip, but, you know, brush cutters, brush saws, those are other really good tools to be more targeted. And I think that's definitely a feasible approach when you have, say, half an acre, 1 acre, you know, maybe a couple acres if you want to, you know, be ambitious. So yeah, definitely. All right, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. We have gone a few minutes over an hour and a half here, so I'd just like to say, you know, if you need to go, you obviously have been free to go at any time since the beginning of this, but we will not be upset about it. But if you have any other questions, I know I am free here for a little bit. Inga said she would be as well, so speak up now here. I'll give everybody another minute or so to think if they have any more questions, comments, or concerns. Or if they just want to tell me how much they love their CRP, because I love hearing that too. All right, well, I don't hear any more questions, so I won't keep anybody on any longer. I don't know if anybody else's stomach is growling a little bit, but it's getting to be that time. So I'll let everybody log off here. And if you have any more questions, just please reach out. I know most of you probably have either my email address or Inga's email address. So we can answer your questions by email. You can give me a phone call. We have our phone numbers up here too. So just feel free to reach out at any time and ask questions if you have them. So we are here for you and we'll be more than happy to help anybody with any questions they might have. So.
Yeah, even when we're not able to answer questions, we usually through the office system, we can pretty much always find somebody that has had an experience with whatever it is someone's dealing with.
Definitely. So yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's really nice to see you all, see some familiar faces, some new faces, and I hope you learned something today. Reach out to us if you have any questions or if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint too, because we do have those available. We'll make available in a PDF form. So if you need to print that out and want to review any of it, that's another resource that we can provide to you too. So if no one else has any parting questions or interruptions here, I will end the meeting. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Erica and Josh with USDA for being online. And thank you, Inga, for with the DNR for coming and joining us as well. And thank you all for all of you participants for taking the time to listen. And you guys are really doing just some very important habitat work on the landscape that no other land managers can do. I mean, it really, private landowners participating in these programs do tremendous things for the state of Iowa and the Midwest as a whole. So thank you so much for continuing to do that for us. And we hope that we can be as good of a resource as we can for you all in the future. So take care, have a wonderful day, and reach out if you have any questions or would like further resources. So take care.
Thanks, Tabitha.
Thank you. Thank you all.